NeverEnding Story is an iconic 80s fantasy film starring Barrett Oliver as bullied bookworm Bastian Balthazar Bucks, who gets more than he bargained for when he borrows and reads a mysterious novel from a mysterious bookstore. While reading the story of the heroic young warrior Atreyu's quest to save the world of Fantasia from the steady encroachment of a terrifying force called the Nothing, Bastian finds himself drawn into the tale, in more ways than one. The film is based on the novel of the same name by German author Michael Ende, and was at the time the most expensive film produced in West Germany at 60 million Deutschmarks or $27 million. It almost earned its budget back in Germany alone, grossing $20 million, and performed well internationally, particularly in Australia and Japan, netting around $100 million overall, about the same as Crazy Rich Asians' worldwide gross in today's dollars. But what you might not know is that there are two different versions of the film. The version released by Warner Brothers in the US and internationally is 7 minutes shorter than the original German version and differs in several significant ways. Before releasing his film in the US, director Wolfgang Petersen showed the English language version of the NeverEnding Story to none other than Steven Spielberg, asking his advice on how to shape it for an American audience. As Petersen told MTV in 2010, so he looked at it and he said he had some really interesting suggestions for some cuts to give it a little bit more pace. Little snippets, nothing major. But it's not quite as simple as that. There are multiple differences in terms of sound, music, and editing. One short scene is missing entirely, and the editing affects the film in ways other than pace. It affects the mood of many scenes and our interpretation of the characters. For a long time it was difficult to compare the two versions because DVD releases of the German cut only featured a German language soundtrack, but the 2013 remastered Blu-ray included English audio for the very first time. So let's take a look at the differences between these two never-ending stories. Let's start with one of the most striking changes that's obvious from the outset: the music. The German cut opens with a mysterious and anxious cue from Klaus Doldinger's original score for the film. Whereas the international version opens with a title song written by Italian electronic dance pioneer Giorgio Moroder and British musician Keith Forsey, and performed by British new wave pop singer Limahl. Which I can't include much of here for fear of triggering YouTube's copyright detection robots.
Copyright alert! Copyright alert!
Oh, fuck. The song also appears over the end credits in the international version, whereas Doldinger went out on a reprise of his romantic theme for the Ivory Tower. Including a title song had become a popular trend for high-concept movies in Hollywood during the 80s, when the rise of MTV provided another avenue for that all-important marketing strategy: the music video. The Moroder-Forsey team had topped the Billboard 100 and won an Academy Award the previous year for their title song for Flashdance, performed and co-written by Irene Cara. The NeverEnding Story is actually a duet between Limahl and American vocalist Beth Anderson, whose beautiful voice represents the childlike empress in the bridge and the chorus. Given that she appears on 2/3 of the song, it's a shame she didn't get equal credit. Oftentimes she wasn't even mentioned at all on record sleeves or appeared as a footnote. Fun fact, Limahl also recorded a French version of the song, L'Histoire sans fin, with Anne Calvert. Anyway, I digress.
Conrad digresses again.
I digress. Giorgio Moroder wasn't just hired to supply a hit theme song, he also provided additional film score cues. Sometimes they appear in places where there is no score in the German version, such as the first scene in Fantasia, where the German version creates a mysterious atmosphere with no score at all. Whereas Marauder adds a pleasant synth cue that lightens the mood. In the Swamps of Sadness sequence, Doldinger introduces the scene with a breathy, dirge-like theme in the German version. Whereas Marauder supplies a more subdued but suspenseful synthesized bass line in the international version.
Everyone knew that whoever let the sadness overtake him would sink into the swamp.
When Atreyu's horse, Artax, stops and begins to sink into the swamp, Marauder introduces his sadness theme, which plays throughout and builds to a climax as Artax dies.
Come on, Artax.
In the German version, Doldinger remains silent during the whole ordeal, which makes the scene even more stark and unsettling.
Come on, boy.
Notice also that you can hear the horse's distress in the German version, which is doubly disturbing. The addition of score in the international version arguably lessens the blow of this terribly sad scene by couching it in the artifice of cinema. It's melodrama rather than the starkly quiet realism of the German version.
Artax! Fight against the sadness, Artax! Artax, please.
Despite this, the result is the same. Every child who saw it in 1985 was scarred for life, myself included. The lead up to Atreyu's meeting with Morla, the Ancient One, is scored with a pensive but ambivalent synth cue from Doldinger in the German version. Whereas the international version uses Marauder's Swamps of Sadness cue, which is darker and more suspenseful. Atreyu's final trudge through the swamp and narrow escape from the evil wolf Gmork gets a dour, low-register synth dirge from Doldinger. Followed by a frenetic epic climax as Luck Dragon Falcor arrives to save the day. But this is replaced in the international version with Marauder's lighter synth style, with a less dramatic but more magical climax for Falcor's arrival. Probably Marauder's most memorable contribution to the score is the Ivory Tower theme. Doldinger scored the Ivory Tower with a variation on the theme he composed for Falcor's flying scenes. But this time with a more stately, deliberate pace. Whereas Marauder gives the tower its own distinct theme, with lofty intervals and a more joyful tone. In a retrospective interview, director Wolfgang Petersen seemed to suggest that Marauder was hired to provide a more modern electronic sensibility to the soundtrack.
Not in the more classic way what Klaus Doldinger did, but with synthesizer and a bit more contemporary feeling for the kids out there.
But it's not that clear-cut. Doldinger's score prominently features synths. and Moroder's Ivory Tower theme obviously features a live string section. So it's more a case of calling upon a second composer to change the mood of the film and to accommodate the new cuts. The end result is 2 soundtrack albums, and if you want the most music from the film, you do need to buy both. The international album features the title song and pop arrangements of Moroder's 4 added themes on what was side 1 on the vinyl and cassette pressings, and a selection of Doldinger's original score on side 2. The German album features a greater selection of Doldinger's score, including cues that are still in the international version of the film but were dropped from the international album. Neither of them presents the full score as it's heard in either version of the film. Moroder's pop disco version of his Ivory Tower theme, which was used as the B-side on many pressings of Lamal's theme song, is particularly frustrating to those who want the version used in the film. Hopefully, a film score speciality label will revisit this one day. What's fascinating when watching the German cut with the English language track, which appeared for the first time on the 2013 Blu-ray, is that some of the voices still differ from those heard in the international version. Presumably, the track we're hearing is the version prepared originally before Steven Spielberg's revisions, so it's interesting to note what they changed. Gmork, the Nothing's wolf-like assassin, has a raspy but believable voice in the German cut.
If you come any closer, I will rip you to shreds.
While the international version gives him a deeper, more resonant voice, apparently with its own built-in reverb.
If you come any closer, I will rip you to shreds.
Which makes him a more formidable supernatural opponent, if somewhat less naturalistic. It's not clear whether the same voice actor provided both versions of Gmork's voice. The IMDb lists Alan Oppenheimer as the uncredited actor behind Rockbiter, Falkor, Gmork, and the narrator who finishes the film.
But that's another story.
The racing snail jockey, Teeny Weeny, or Winzling, meaning mite in German, is voiced by Frank Lenart in the international cut, with an accent the actor described to me as mid-Atlantic son of German-American Jews who returned to Germany from California after World War II.
We are on the same mission. After all, if the Empress can't save us, who could?
But in the newly revealed English soundtrack on the German cut, he has a strong southern drawl.
We're on the same mission. After all, if the Empress can't save us, who could?
This isn't Frank Lenart, and he has no idea who it is. Curious. It's also curious that the character is dubbed at all. He's played by veteran actor, stuntman and puppeteer Deep Roy, whose diminutive size, he's 4'4", made him a go-to performer for fantastical characters, such as Droopy McCool in Return of the Jedi, doubling for Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, Keenzer in the Kelvin Timeline Star Trek movies, and 165 Oompa Loompas in Tim Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So he's played speaking roles, and his line delivery for Teeny Weeny was perfectly fine, as you can hear in this behind-the-scenes footage.
Don't worry, it's a racing snail.
Now it's time for Random Trivia. Did you know that David Fincher, the genius director of films such as Seven, Fight Club, and Gone Girl, worked on the special effects for The NeverEnding Story? Fincher started his movie-making career at Industrial Light and Magic in 1983 and worked in matte photography effects in Return of the Jedi, The NeverEnding Story, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom before leaving to pursue a career in directing music videos. He's credited on The NeverEnding Story as Dave Fincher. And that's my random trivia. Goodbye.
Director Wolfgang Peterson characterized Spielberg's suggested edits to the film as little snippets, nothing major, to give it a little more pace. And this is mostly true. Many of the edits remove repetitions and have no noticeable impact on the story, the mood, or our reading of the characters. For example, this scene where Bastian is bullied by 3 classmates is tightened imperceptibly by small cuts, like removing one of the pairs of shots of the children running.
Get away, you jerk!
But some of the cuts do affect the film's tone, as well as the interplay of the characters. A great example of this comes right at the start, where the international version cuts 2 20-second stretches of Bastian sitting silently alone, first in his room, and later after the conversation with his father. Both of these silent moments underline Bastian's loneliness and grief in the wake of his mother's death. Remember that the opening titles on the international version play out over beautiful cloud tank sky effects, setting a magical atmosphere with Limahl's upbeat theme song, whereas the German version opens with titles on a black screen and Doldinger's urgent Mysterioso score. This gives us a very different impression of the dream Bastian apparently wakes from suddenly in the first shot. We know he was dreaming about his mum.
I had another dream, Dad. About Mom.
But the black screen and score suggest the dream might have been a nightmare. Could Bastian have been dreaming about the nothing?
The nothing!
In any case, on waking, he certainly has no enthusiasm for getting on with his day. We're introduced to a child who sits on the edge of his bed, staring blankly into the void. And later, who can't summon the will to finish buttering and eating his toast. This isn't just the sad child we see in the international version. This Bastian is severely depressed. There are micro-edits in Bastian's conversation with his father too, but here they do more than just hasten the pace. They also rob the scene of a faltering, awkward quality that speaks volumes about Bastian's distant relationship with his father. These cuts are achieved without removing a single line of dialogue. The same is true of Atreyu's meeting with Morla, the Ancient One.
Morla, the Ancient One.
Where the mood is unaltered. It's still slow and tedious enough to justify Atreyu's frustration with the apathetic tortoise. In other places, lines are cut, sometimes to the detriment of sense. In his conversation with Mr. Coriander in the bookstore, Bastian's exasperated line,
But you just said it was...
only makes sense in the longer German cut where Coriander has an extra line where he contradicts himself.
The ones you read are safe.
And that one isn't?
Don't worry about it.
But you just said it was...
Don't worry about it.
What's so different about it?
Oh, nothing.
But you just said it was...
There's another cut in the international version of this scene that I've always found awkward. Coriander asks Bastian why he doesn't defend himself against the bullies, and after Bastian fails to answer, we cut to Coriander already turning away, as though he's lost interest or doesn't care. But in the German version, we see that he does. Other line deletions arguably strengthen the characters, like those in the scene where Atreyu and Gmork finally meet. In the German cut, Atreyu offers to help Gmork, which makes Atreyu seem incredibly kind, but somewhat naive.
Can I help you?
If you come any closer, I will rip you to shreds.
Especially as he's just seen a terrifying image of Gmork at the end of an eerily accurate set of cave paintings depicting his adventures. In the German cut, Gmork also continues to speak about Atreyu in the third person after revealing his name.
His name was Atreyu. have stalked him for so long. I am almost too weak to kill you. But I will find the strength.
Let me give you new strength, Gmork! If we're about to die anyway, I'd rather die fighting! Come for me, Gmork! I am Atreyu!
In the international version, the name reveal leads directly to their confrontation as Atreyu confirms that he is the person Gmork has been looking for.
His name was Atreyu.
If we're about to die anyway, I'd rather die fighting! Come for me, Gmork! I am Atreyu!
Here, it looks like Gmork is either toying with Atreyu when they first meet, or at least very suspicious of him. In the German version, he genuinely doesn't know who Atreyu is, which is kind of hard to believe when he came within biting distance of him in the Swamps of Sadness. Urgel loses several lines in her scene too, but these cuts don't change how we perceive her. She's still a kind but no-nonsense doctor who enjoys teasing her bookish husband, Engewuk.
That's my batwing broth. There's eye of newt in there, tree mold, old lizard brains, scales from a rancid sea serpent, flavoured with sandworms. Organically grown, of course.
Just where did you and your dragon come from? What are you onto? Anything of interest to the scientific community?
He thinks he is the scientific community.
Still, it's always a shame to lose any moments of the late Patricia Hayes.
Why don't you sit down and be quiet for once?
The tighter editing of the finale with the Empress.
The Empress.
Eliminates redundant lines like Bastian paraphrasing what the Empress has already said about him.
He simply can't imagine that one little boy could be that important. Is it really me? How could I make any difference?
Removes increasingly petulant screeching from Atreyu that makes him less appealing as a character.
What if he doesn't come up with the right name? Where is he? Why isn't he here?
And gives a much greater sense of accelerating jeopardy. It's undeniable that the international version of the climax is more exhilarating.
Don't you have the courage to save us? Bastian. I wish I could! Why don't you do what you dream, Bastian? But I can't! I have to keep my feet on the ground! Call my name. Please. Call my name.
There's only one instance where the scenes are shown in a different order in the two cuts, Atreyu's riding montage. The international version has a single 45-second montage before the scene that introduces Gmork, whereas the German version splits the montage in half, with Gmork appearing in the middle. The former seems to work better to me in terms of pace and flow, particularly in terms of the music, but that just may be my over-familiarity with the international cut. But even this has an effect on our emotional involvement in the film. Cutting from Gmork launching into his quest with a snarl and fangs bared, to Atreyu asleep in a clearing, makes our hero seem much more vulnerable than when we cut to him riding boldly across the sunset. It also makes us, the audience, immediately worry for him and creates suspense, because we know something he doesn't, and we know he really shouldn't be asleep right now. There are a few cases where less than special effects shots have been judiciously removed or cut short in the international version, such as 2 shots of the miniature Falkor in the storm that separates him from Atreyu, which betray his size and immobility, and undermine the effectiveness of the scene. Or the shot where Falkor dives into the ocean to retrieve the Orin, which is cut short to avoid the part where the model tips over, betraying its lack of weight, and starts to float back to the surface again. Although note that this is a rare case where the international version of a scene includes a shot that the German version lacks, an establishing shot of sunlight glinting on the Orin under the water, which sets the scene more effectively than cutting directly to Falkor's dive. The German version reveals Gmork in full right after Atreyu narrowly escapes his jaws in the swamps of sadness, whereas the international version eliminates this shot, so we only see Gmork in full in the final confrontation in the ruins. But the international version adds more spectacle in the first Ivory Tower scene, where Charon informs the people of Fantasia that the Empress is dying. Here, viewers outside Germany were treated to more reaction shots showing the weird and wonderful characters in the crowd.
I also know that you have come to beseech the Empress for help. But
One piece of random trivia: there are several famous characters hidden in plain sight in the wide shots of the tower. We have C-3PO, some Ewoks, E.T. and Mickey Mouse, among others. This is a fun Easter egg, and an acknowledgement that such characters would theoretically exist in Fantasia, which is, after all, the world of all human fantasy. There's one case where we have different versions of a shot to accommodate language differences on the title of the book and Bastian's note. Again, the international version of this scene includes a shot the German version lacks, that of Bastian taking the book and starting to run, which might be there to clarify what's happening or to hide a cut to the shot of Coriander on the phone. There is only one scene that's deleted in its entirety in the international cut. It comes after Bastian's first reading session, after we've met the rockbiter and the racing snail. In the international version, we cut directly to the night hob in flight to the Ivory Tower. In the German version, we cut back to Bastian in the real world, where he's interrupted by a visitor to the school attic. This scene with the caretaker could arguably be said to create some tension about whether Bastian is going to be discovered and his literary quest brought to an abrupt end. But it isn't all that tense, because the caretaker is so clumsy and focused on his own grievances that he doesn't notice anything is amiss or go looking for Bastian. As it does nothing to further the plot, illuminate character, or enhance the mood, cutting this 1-minute scene would seem like a good call. In a final analysis, I think a comparison of the German and international cuts of the NeverEnding Story reveal many more subtle yet significant differences than Wolfgang Petersen's comments would suggest. The international version is brisker, more effective in building empathy and suspense, and has a more exciting finale. But the German version is darker, more unflinching in its depiction of grief, depression, and death, which is essentially what The Nothing is all about. Bastian processes his mother's death by passing her name on to the Empress in this world of fantasy, and as a result, her spirit and his creativity are reborn. Incidentally, if you've ever wondered what it is that Bastian shouts from the window at the climax of the movie, it's Moonchild. I discovered this by reading the book, but these days you could just turn on the subtitles on your Blu-ray. So the key themes of grief and loss are more explicit in the German version and more affecting, but that version also contains some distractingly poor effects shots, some disappointing character beats, and long moments that don't advance the plot. And there's no Lamal. Ultimately, the version you prefer will depend on your taste, and which version you're most familiar with from childhood, but I definitely recommend checking out both. One thing you may have noticed during this comparison is the stark difference between the picture quality on the two Blu-rays. The remastered Blu-ray released in Germany in 2013 seems to feature a more stable, less damaged and less contrasty image, but some disc reviewers have criticised its use of digital noise reduction, which eliminates grain but takes fine detail along with it. For example, look at the freckles and other skin details on Barrett Oliver's face in this magnified shot. Warner Brothers had to apologise for incorrectly describing its 30th anniversary Blu-ray of the international version as remastered. In fact, only the lackluster sequel had been remastered. So we're still lacking a definitive high-def presentation of this classic as I speak. Regardless of its comparative merits, the international cut suggested by Steven Spielberg propelled the NeverEnding Story to box office success worldwide and launched director Wolfgang Petersen's career in English-language movie making, leading to such hits as Outbreak, Air Force One, and The Perfect Storm. For his part, Spielberg was rewarded with a special gift, the Orin. The prop is, by all accounts, in a glass case in the director's office, a fitting tribute to the director who shaped the fantasy lives of a generation.